Flag pointer.
Right, that's what I thought. But I thought there was a project for you.
Well, Mark,
Possibility.
Smile.
Okay.
So I'll just start by saying I'm Ruth Hopkins. I'm a member of the Lansing Town Board. It's great to see folks coming out on a rainy, cold, wet night. Just to show of hands, who's here because you got a postcard? I'm glad. We never know if postcards work. And who's here because they saw it on a calendar, an events calendar? So I'm assuming the rest of you heard word of mouth or by email.
I just heard about the cookies.
Well, the meeting tonight is part of a project that I did last July with the help of the planning office and the support of the planning board. It was to get some help on an idea that had been bubbling up around town from all those areas, as well as around the county and other towns. We were talking about it, and I think we were using different language. We were saying things like smart planning, cluster housing, what else were we? Multiple use development, and we were gradually converged on something called form-based code planning, or planning for form-based codes. It seems to wrap itself around those. So tonight, Design Connect, an independent student organization from Cornell with graduate students in professional areas or otherwise, and undergraduate students who want professional training in planning are here. They tell me that they help communities plan and take on projects that last a semester. And we know from a year ago, when they did a transportation study for us, that they do a terrific job. So we invited them back. And with that, Bell, they're fearlessly good.
All right.
Cheers.
Thank you very much, Ruth. Yeah, so just very quickly, we received the application from Ruth and the town at the end of last year, and so since basically, that's what it is, September, I've been working with the town with the concept, which is which the rest of my team is going to go more in depth in, but just to help out the town, do some research into the concepts, find examples of places that are using form-based code to pursue the goals that they have regarding land use and having their town develop in a way that they prefer, and just also try to get ourselves really understanding the context of Lansing as best we can, so that we can offer some recommendations and show sort of how that works, how it might work here if Lansing were to pursue form-based code. So we're just going to go through a couple of sections today, looking at the current zoning in Lansing, and so just a refresher on how it works and what places are are zoned for in the current zoning. Then we'll introduce the concept of form-based codes and provide some examples, and then we'll also just do a little bit of a couple pictures, show you, remind of sort of recent development of what's happening right now in Lansing. And with that, well, let's go.
Good evening, folks. So my name is Carlos. Thank you guys very much for coming out tonight. I wanted to talk a little bit about traditional zoning. I'm sure some of you are very familiar with that, sometimes too much. So the idea of zoning is that you're regulating the use, and that's the main thing. You're looking at what kind of uses are going inside of this land and how can we kind of spatially regulate that. You can see on the left picture, this is an example of a zoning map, and so you've got these different districts or zones where you have, commercial, residential, industrial. Usually it's nowhere near as neat as this. Usually there's a lot of, complexity that goes into land use. And, it kind of makes sense sometimes to separate these uses out. Usually you don't want like a coal plant right next to a house or a slaughterhouse right next to a park. And so you try to separate these uses apart. What happens sometimes is that when you get these kind of individual zones, each of those zones becomes kind of this one-size-fits-all. And so you get one type of regulation that goes into this, and you're trying to take the entire complexity of that area and prescribe regulations for that. Prescriptive zoning then makes it very much where you have to codify what you can and cannot do. There's not a lot of flexibility with it. And so you get a lot of these kind of restrictions. You can see on the right side, this is a setback diagram from Lansing's land use code. And so you can see, this is how you detail. You need 10 feet, 100-foot setback in a front yard. You need, certain heights. It has to specify a lot of things there. Inside of zoning, inside of Lansing, this is our kind of target area that we were directed to kind of look into for the possibility of different zoning types. Within that, there's the 4 residential districts. So of course you've got residential agriculture, which is generally low-density agricultural uses and allows some commercial related to agriculture. You have R1, which is a low density. It's about a dwelling unit per acre. R2, a little more moderate density. You allow kind of 2 dwelling units per acre. Residential mixed transitional, which is kind of allowing some mixed uses, but then also trying to create a transitory zone between agriculture and some of these other areas. And then with non-residential, there's a B1, which is a commercial mixed-use area. And so while we separate uses, traditional zoning can still kind of prescribe different things that are able to be mixed together. So this is an example of one of those. The B1 being in kind of the central area of this area allows more of a moderate density. It does allow some residential in there, some small-scale retail, kind of trying to mix some of these uses together. With B2, you get general business. It's more just a straight general commercial zone. And then, of course, with industrial research, it's more of the manufacturing, industrial uses, in more of those kind of larger facilities that tend to be a little farther away from residential. So with that, we'll go to...
Thanks, Rachel. Yeah. So I'm just curious, out of everybody here tonight, who has heard of form-based code before you saw form-based code on the screen? Okay, so about half of people. I'm happy that our clients have heard of it as well. So rather than what Carlos was just talking about, the key difference between traditional zoning and land use and form-based code is that form-based code really focuses on regulating form and character of a particular area rather than the separation of uses, which we just saw and what Carlos was just talking about. And we'll move on to our textbook definition of form-based code, but really the key takeaways about it and what everyone should really know about it is that it's a form of land development regulation that emphasizes the built environment rather than land use. It considers a broader picture of land development rather than having a narrow scope or a narrow focus. And it's, as opposed to design guidelines, it actually is regulation, and it becomes and is adopted by a municipality as law. And FBCs are seen as an alternative to traditional zoning, particularly today. So what is the history of form-based code? Where did it come from? What does it come out of? And that really is that it emerged out of this movement called New Urbanism. And New Urbanism, as we can see here, we have another textbook definition, but it really is this design movement that emerged in the late 70s and early 80s that was about a goal to create and restore compact, diverse, walkable, mixed-use towns and cities, emphasizing town centers, public spaces, buildings being close to the street, proximity of essential community features, schools, services, places of employment, all of that. And it tried to eliminate sprawl, reduce automobile traffic, and reinforce a sense of community. So it's this really idealistic movement with some things that everybody at the time was saying, we really want these, and we feel like we're losing these things in our communities. The first modern application of form-based code was in Seaside, Florida, which was this beach town on Florida's Panhandle in 1980.
Is it really only 80 acres? That's a tiny town.
Yeah, it is small. I was actually down on the Panhandle this past summer, and it is small and dense.
I thought maybe it was 800 or 8,000 acres.
Nope, it's small. So this is actually a visual primer. Let's see if I can get. There we go. So this is a visual primer on what form-based code essentially is, what it depicts, and what it's capable of doing in certain areas and achieving. And some of the main key takeaways from this video are that form-based codes encourage a mix of land use rather than a separation of uses. Form-based code is also very site-specific. It's not generic as in traditional zoning. It's intended to stand the longer test of time and embrace change rather than being initially difficult to conceptualize or hard to visualize and being rigid. And it also emphasizes the social components of a community in the present rather than only looking at future needs of the community. Let's see, a little bit more. And there is no line. You're seeing some of the same imagery that you saw on the table back there as well. So bring some of those images to mind when you're watching this video. So we selected a series of case studies that we've been looking at as part of our project for the semester. And when we were looking and trying to develop a list of comparable places to Lansing, it's somewhat difficult to do that. And so Lansing is a little bit different than each of these places, but we found key takeaways from each of these communities that reminded us of something in Lansing and that we thought was relevant to the discussion about form-based code potentially being implemented here. So our three examples that we'll be talking about tonight are Saratoga Springs, New York, Malta, and Port Royal, South Carolina. For each of these municipalities, and for all of them that are here, we developed a series of 6 questions that we thought would provide us with some insight as to what form-based code is in that particular place, and key takeaways from that place that could be potentially informative to Lansing. So the 6 questions were, why did we select this municipality? Why did this municipality seek to implement form-based code? Who was involved in that process? How long did that process take? And how were the codes received by the public? And additionally, was the form-based code viewed as successful? So the first case study that we're looking at is Saratoga Springs, New York. And Saratoga Springs, New York is a very well-known upstate New York municipality that has implemented form-based code. A lot has been written about Saratoga's implementation about form-based code, and it's well known as being a success story of form-based code as well. Their form-based codes have specifically targeted areas within the municipality, and they've adopted one type of form-based code, which is called transect-based or smart code. Saratoga Springs sought to basically build upon their historic downtown, and they wanted to take the qualities of their historic downtown and apply it to other areas within Saratoga Springs that weren't seeing the same type of development. They wanted to apply those same standards that they had in their historic downtown to these other areas as well. And they were experiencing somewhat of a drought of new construction in their historic downtown in the late 1990s. Rehab projects were occurring, but there wasn't any real new construction except for one key project that was the Congress Park Center, and that really actually piqued the interest in implementing form-based codes. And from that, they selected their historic downtown area to implement form-based codes, as well as 2 areas on the periphery of Saratoga Springs. Who was involved in that process? Well, traditionally, planning staff are involved, volunteers, and also a consulting firm called Environmental Design and Research, based out of Syracuse, New York. They were all involved in the process. It was initially proposed in 2000, and finally, and that process lasted through 2003, being adopted in 2004. The initial public reaction to form-based code was confused and skeptical. They feared overgrowth, and they also feared that they were handing the planning department too much power as part of the process of adopting the form-based code. But since then, they've seen that and their initial investment in the project was only $43,000 at the time, and by 2007, over $200 million had been invested in new construction projects, and over $1 billion, and that were also reflected over $1 billion new square feet. So the outcome in Saratoga has been pretty positive. Moving into Malta, which is a more recent example of a municipality adopting form-based code. Malta initially sought to implement form-based code as a reaction to all of the new growth that they were experiencing. There were 2 large tech companies that moved into the municipality, which spurred this huge amount of growth. And the other reason we selected Malta as a case study is because it's incredibly well documented. They recorded every single step of the process. You can actually still go online and find an entire website dedicated to that process. So it's very informative and exactly outlined each step and also the challenges they faced along the way. It's very informative. The substantial new growth really led the community to taking this proactive approach to preserving what they saw was their community, its character, and basically the town center. The town of Malta was involved in this, the Capital District Transportation Committee, and a series of other planning firms were also associated with the project. So it took quite a few groups of people. The process here was a bit longer than it was in Saratoga. It began in 2005 and was actually really finally completed by 2015. They did adopt a first version of form-based code in 2013, but they went through a revision process at 2015 and was adopted. We'll go into Port Royal in a second. But with Malta, the public initially wasn't actually very pleased with the process. Let me go back so you can see the quote. So one of the quotes that I found was that the people have spoken, we do not want this. It wasn't popular initially, to be honest. And it was funded by the town of Malta, the Transportation Linkage Program. And although it wasn't popular, there are also positive remarks as well, and there's people on both sides arguing whether or not it's what they wanted or not. But they haven't seen additional new growth in the form-based code area, so really the outcome is yet to be determined with Malta. And Carlos will take us home to Port Royal.
Hey there again. So Port Royal, South Carolina, obviously, quite a different geographic area. Port Royal was another early adopter in 1993. It was a relatively quick process for them. They adopted it in, I believe, less than a year. We chose Port Royal because it has a similar population density to Lansing. It also is kind of a historic town. It kind of has this somewhat similar character to what Lansing somewhat has. This municipalities chose to implement form-based codes because they were trying to kind of develop this historic area that they had. They wanted to kind of preserve and kind of grow in a way that reinforced the existing character there. And that flexibility is something that's a lot easier to get through form-based codes. Similar in this process, the town was involved, of course. They hired a consulting firm, and they worked a lot with the planning committee. As you can see here, it was a relatively quick adoption, so it took them less than a year, which is not too common. In Port Royal, though, it's been very well received by the public, and they've also received some planning awards for that. So, and we'll go on to development.
Okay, so now we will talk about the development and market analysis section for the town of Lansing. Looking at this graph, we can estimate that the total number of single-family detached housing built from 2004 to 2014 is approximately 30 units per year, and that for multifamily housing is less than 10 units per year. The owner-occupied housing values graph here tells us that the median value of a house is between $150,000 to $200,000. And as for the housing rent prices, the median value is between $500 and $750 per month. Just a reminder that these are some pictures of the recent developments that happened in the town of Lansing. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm sure this has been kind of something to think about. Do people have any questions that we can further explain the parts that are most interesting, least interesting, or perhaps just unclear?
Do you have pictures of the South Carolina development?
What about that?
Do you have pictures of that?
We do have pictures. It's a good point that we don't have any in the actual side. Unfortunately, we don't have them at the moment.
Was that on the coast, the South Carolina?
It is on the coast. In fact, it's in a place that's in sort of a tidewater area. So I believe it's an island. If not, it's kind of
Barrier
in
island
between, or a little bit more. It's in between a couple of. Have you been to Port? Yeah. What's your impression?
It's a great area. Hunting Island is
Yeah, exactly.
To sort of tourist oriented?
Some things, I think.
yeah.
Do you have more thoughts on that? Yeah.
You end up with a map and you would then traditional zoning. You end up with something to look at to see what
We
you
do end up with, we don't have, I guess we didn't include, one thing about form-based code is it has more than just a map as far as visual representations. Oftentimes you have diagrams of form in different locations. Do you have an example?
Yeah. So, I mean, there's a lot of different variations of form-based code, and it can take on a lot of different forms as well. Yeah, one of the, no. It was at the beginning of Saratoga. So, kind of building on these and like representing different, on the left is an example of Saratoga, one of the transects that they actually developed for their urban core. And then generally what accompanies this in the form-based code are these more just like graphic descriptions of exactly what form you're trying to get in your community. So it's generally a little bit more detailed than the one that we have here, but it is similar.
Do any of these people have to put in like public water and sewer in order for your form-based things to take place?
Not
Is that put into the budget?
for, that wasn't part of, I don't think, any of the case studies that we looked at, no. But we're also, I think, part of our project is just looking at that one particular area. But,
I think they already had.
If
Yeah.
they already have it?
they already had it.
In each
So we don't have it, so
Yeah.
we need to find a place that is like us.
Yep. That's been
Do you have available a copy of a sample form-based code?
Yes.
That would be useful because I'm still kind of fuzzy about what it is. Is it the form of the building, the shape of the building?
It can take on, if you look here, go back.
And I'd like to see how that is translated into code.
So this is like what's traditionally recognized as the transect-based, form-based code. But this is just the beginning stages. Essentially, you identify, the first step of the process is to identify what areas of your community fall within something similar to each of these different transects. And then what you do is there's a scoping process, and it goes out into this long-term implementation process that can take over a year. And you scope out the areas. It involves imagery and taking pictures, and each step of the process also involves a charrette and all of these different ways of outreach to the community and getting community input. And basically by working together through that process and determining what each area looks like or what you want it to look like gets translated into a code. That is not the same as building code, and it's not the same as land use code. It's generally easier to read, more understandable, uses more relatable terms to the general public, not so planning oriented. But it takes this, if you can think about it in terms of, it's similar to design guidelines, but the key difference between them is that it's regulation and law rather than being recommendation.
Rather than?
Recommendation.
Okay.
So law rather than recommendation.
So translate that into something that you showed us earlier in the pictures. In other words, you took a fairly ordinary looking street, and all of a sudden I saw street lights, and I saw trees appear, and I saw awnings appear,
Awnings, yeah.
benches.
The sidewalks widen.
Do those particular specific things become the code? How does that get, how do you decide what those things are that make the neighborhood?
The key characteristics, that happens through what's called the scoping process, which happens in the first step of what is generally broken down into 3 stages. So the scoping is the first step where you go out and, like I said, you take imagery of the community, determine what areas of the community are of particular interest to the public, and then you document those areas, survey and document, determine what are the qualities, what are the key qualities you want to continue seeing, and what qualities you don't want to see anymore. And it does require development as well. There is a development component here. This just doesn't happen by itself, but what happens is that you have these guidelines in place that have to be followed.
So in other words, development meaning a developer, let's just say it's downtown, and we all envision some cute thing over here as a downtown. you would do some sort of layout or code or whatever you're saying, and then the final step, I guess, is a developer or someone coming in and doing it as it's defined, or
Yep.
as it's been determined, more or less.
Yeah, they would be familiar with what the form-based code is,
Right.
what it dictates,
Right.
and know that whatever their development is, it needs to conform to those
So
guidelines.
the sidewalk might have benches on it, the sidewalk might have be treed,
Yeah.
whatever, according to this work that was done previous to them coming in, developing in a particular space,
Yep.
2 or 3 stories or whatever it is.
And it's a pretty long visioning process to get that together, which is
Right.
why sometimes it takes a really long time, is you have to get people together and say, what do you want this to kind of look like? What things are we going to be flexible on? What are we not going to be flexible on? And it does take some time, and it does take, getting that together.
Is your role or this role, actually, are there actually 3-dimensional vignettes of this? I got here a little late to this, but
That would be part of the process.
Part of the process would be a look.
That form-based code. And there's one thing about form-based code is that it's very flexible as far as the amount of detail So you could have a form-based code that requires a brown bench or whatever, right?
Right.
But oftentimes, form-based codes, which are more simple,
Doesn't go.
are more towards, this is where you have to place the front of the building in this district, for example.
Right. Or there might not be any signage.
Exactly. Whereas oftentimes in Euclidean zoning, it's more often that there's a maximum, or a maximum or a minimum. So like for a setback, it must be at least 30 feet, but you could go 70 feet back. Oftentimes, the form-based code, specifies exactly where that will be in order to build the character. Right? I mean, that's one of the possible.
So for a Lansing, say a Lansing town center, which we kind of don't really have. Big question is, where is Lansing? There is no sense of, four corners and street, street light down there at the T. This would help to locate where, say, I'm just bringing up an example here, a town center might be for Lansing. I mean, it's kind of here, it's kind of where we are.
I think that's definitely one of the ways in which it's used. I think both Saratoga and Malta are examples of that. For example, Saratoga choosing to create sort of alternative centers from downtown Saratoga by using the form-based code to build a character and sort of a nucleus of an alternative area. And that with the idea of transects is so that rather than if you, in traditional zoning, you say, okay, we have moderate density, residential, medium, low density, without this kind of orients the development a little bit more by sort of being a little bit more specific and more orienting around certain character.
And so say how the town center was laid out, we go through a process of input. There would be a drawing or a plan view or something, and then that would be reviewed.
Yeah, generally there's quite an extensive public review process.
And it can be tested too.
Yeah.
So you can apply it to one particular area and work through that area, small scope, narrow it, and over time gradually expand it. That's sort of how Saratoga did it. And I think it's also important to note that when just looking at Saratoga versus Malta, we have two entirely different form-based codes because one, they are site-specific, but the other reasoning is just in terms of depth. So Saratoga was an early version of form-based code, and their form-based code section as part of their land use development plan is only about 8 pages. Whereas Malta has over 100 pages of in-depth, which probably reflects that huge time process that it took them. So it really depends on how broadly you want to apply it, whereas in Malta it was everywhere. Saratoga was in one particular place and then expanding to 2 other places. So it's a flexible process.
Yeah.
The fact that the Malta plan took up 100 pages or so, do you think that might have be one of the reasons why a number of people were against it?
It's an interesting.
Just like
Well, actually, that particular quote that I showed, that was someone who was clearly not the biggest fan of the implementation of form-based code in Malta, was more out of a result of the changes to taxing of business and its relationship to the time period that form-based code was implemented. That's not traditionally part of the form-based code implementation process, but it was a change to taxing small business that was directly connected to it. So it may not have been
not necessarily
yeah. Yeah, no.
That particular.
It was part of like the consensus process that they went through. It was also a changing of zoning and small business this was a small business owner who wasn't particularly pleased with it.
Yeah.
Did any of your studies deal with the conversion of an existing traditional zoning plan to a form-based zoning plan? Because it would seem to me that if you have an established zoning plan and then you try to convert it to something else, you're going to have a whole ton of grandfathered areas and structure.
I think all of the cases already had a a zoning network set up, and generally when you change zoning, and zoning evolves over time, whether it's Euclidean or whether it's a form-based zoning, the buildings that exist are not affected. In that way, of course, they're able to keep as is. And I think in many places, the motivation to use a form-based code is actually to be able to maintain the existing neighborhoods. In many places, it's less true in Lansing, in particular in places that have quite small lots. It wouldn't be possible to rebuild a building as is according to existing zoning, and form-based code is often implemented to rectify. Oftentimes you have sort of late 19th century neighborhoods and houses that are pretty small lots that are kind of close to each other. Oftentimes zoning which was implemented, say, in the second half of the 20th century, doesn't allow buildings to be as close as that. So form-based codes are often used to permit that again, so people can rebuild or expand in the traditional structure of those neighborhoods.
And each of the examples that we showed tonight too all had pre-existing land use zoning and reflect the transition process. But I think it's also important to note that you can overlay form-based code to a traditional zoning, land use zoning as well. So you don't have to throw out what you already have, but add on. And in Saratoga's case, we've adopted it in these particular locales, but the rest of Saratoga still operates under a separation of uses, traditional Euclidean zoning. And in Malta, they had zoning before, but it wasn't because of the spur of new development. They decided to transition over to form-based code, and that also reflects the longer time period there as well.
How does form-based zoning relate to use of alternative energy systems, wind, solar, passive system design? How does that overlay with form-based code?
Or is that more of an architectural, down the line when the developer comes in?
You're dealing with issues of the shape of roofs and sets, kind of the kit of parts. And Lansing, someone in the back raised the issue that there is no sewer here, and there is no lighting district, and there is. So it's kind of like this new development has a great opportunity to really exploit that type of design in the town of Lansing. And it might be really beneficial to approach design from that standpoint.
Form-based code certainly gives a lot of leeway in terms of, if that's something that the community of Lansing, if they were ever to adopt form-based code, saw it as a priority, it could be worked into it. Into form-based code, and developers would be aware as a result of what they could and couldn't do based on that.
So the challenge is the site, development of the site.
What is the reason this is happening? Why do they want to build more apartments or something in the area to bring more people into the area?
Just a general inquiry.
Really?
Yeah. No, there's no underlying reason. It was an idea. Well, we are in the middle of a comprehensive plan. We are in the middle of writing a comprehensive plan. It is an idea that bubbled up there. It's bubbling up everywhere. We do have a lot of development in the pipeline in Lansing. And so there's interest in different ways of looking at the guidelines for that kind of development. Both from the comprehensive planning point of view, which is the long-range view. That's a 20-year view.
So they're trying to change the zoning so that they can build whatever they want on wherever they want. So they want to.
No,
it's like they want to take the zoning that's presently in Lansing and be able to change it so that they can build whatever they want on it.
Actually, it's kind of the opposite.
It really restricts what you can.
I think in a use in a circumstance like that, which I think to some extent is true in Lansing, that there is interest in building and people are building. Form-based code is a way, potentially, if people are able to come to a consensus on preferences for how to build things, what character, it allows more opportunity to guide how that development takes place. If there already is, activity, if there already are people trying to build things and able to build things. And I think that Lansing, like we showed, there's a moderate level of activity, and I think the amount of projects underway right now in pre-development, is substantial, and I think that a form-based code might be a way that a community like Lansing might be able to take that energy, that interest by developers, and kind of guide it in a way that the town in general prefers. And I think that's kind of the goal of any zoning, but I think form-based code is an opportunity to maybe focus on the form in a way that's most preferred.
It's sort of form-based code in a way reflects a different way of looking at the balance of interest between a community and developers coming into the community. So on the one hand, form-based code is more prescriptive because the community has emerged at a consensus and they know what they want, and they tell developers exactly what they want, and then developers pretty much have to conform to what that looks like. However, on the opposite end of things, from a developer's point of view, they're coming in and saying, okay, I have to make what I'm doing look a certain way because that's the community, how they want it. But I'm not restricted in terms of use, and also the review process is simpler because I already know what I need to make my building look like. So it's a different balance of interests than traditional zoning, but really when looking at it, form-based code is actually more restrictive in terms of design, but not as much in terms of use.
So it's introducing aesthetics, really, into zoning.
Yeah, it has, yeah, exactly. It has more of a look at aesthetics than Euclidean zoning tends to have. I mean, I think what you see now pretty commonly as form-based code has become more familiar is a lot of places use some kind of hybrid. So they use some form-based elements in there. So either it's restricted to a certain area or it's an optional situation, but there's a lot of overlap, but it represents one way of looking at zoning, one set of objectives or a range of objectives.
Do you guys, in the town of Lansing, I've got one of those maps, so it's on the line, it's a target area. Do you guys have a target area where you think that this is appropriate in the town of Lansing? Because I'm kind of curious as to how it relates to the agricultural side of things, because maybe you could restrict residential development in the agricultural districts, but you're going to have a real hard time telling the farmer how he can and can't build his farm. I don't think you can pass that law anyway in the state. So
yeah,
is that a target?
The target
area
area, that was just as we were beginning the project, where sort of the center of South Lansing, where we were looking more.
Where you think this is most appropriate?
Potentially. Yeah, that was set at the beginning of the project.
No, I get that, but I'm just kind of curious because it's a really rural area. It's kind of like this has been all farms since, what is it, Simeon DeWitt.
Yeah.
And his whole survey of the military grounds. These farms go back that far. And it's a huge part of the character of this town. And I'm not sure how to.
Form-based code, from the studies that we've done and the research that we've done on it, has actually been known to be very protective. So we were talking with a form-based code expert, and he was telling us how it's actually one of the best ways to preserve farmland. And based upon you set your transect, and that's all that can really occur. So you choose the rural end of the transect.
The transect, again, is that.
Why don't you explain the T's, how it works?
Yeah.
Do you know the soil types and that some of those big farm lands that you would be interested in seeing form-based code development?
Soil type?
Soil types, yes. You don't have agriculture, much of agriculture nowadays without soil. Okay? And that's very important because there are some soils that are very precious. Once you build on them, they're gone forever for agriculture. Well, maybe not forever, but lacking expense and effort, they're gone. And you don't know, and I suggest that before you talk much more, you better look into that very carefully.
Yeah, soil definitely added to the list of things to look into.
So it seems to me that you could apply something like this in this area of Lansing, where they want to get to the town center. And a short surrounding area, but home would be appropriate for the whole town. And it looks like it would be, go back to the slide. You might try this in B1 area.
I think if you go back to the transect, I think one of the issues that is probably easier to try to discover is that on top is what's called the section, and on the bottom is the plan view, so it's kind of hard to understand this, but on the left is what they call a T1 or transect 1 zone, which is really the very rural areas of your community. So it could be natural, it could be farmland, it could be those kind of types of uses. And then as you get more dense, the rural area, the T2, you have a little bit more density, you have a little bit more buildings. Probably Lansing would probably stop at about a T3, and that would be the center part of the town. And maybe what you do is like they have the example of filling in a building, and you use Rhodes Harbor as kind of like the base. And you just say, we're going to go with that same scale of building on that corner and build a town center through that intersection. I mean, that makes the most sense. So here, we probably just use the first 2 or 3 zones, because we don't have any skyscrapers, we don't have any urban areas, things of that nature. But, you can get into some sidewalks in the T3 and some of those things that I think that everybody looked at with the town center concept really was developing those same thoughts. And it's just a question of how you couch it.
I'd like to ask a question, and that's in the context of the town center. When we went over this a few years ago doing the comprehensive plan, we reviewed all the zoning and everything and came up with some suggestions about having a town center.
Could you speak up a bit, Herb?
Yeah. Sure. A few years ago, when we all went, there was a group of us who went through the code and made some recommendations, and at that time, the town center concept kind of gelled. And we had some discussions with the county planning board because they believe in this thing called nodal development. And this kind of, I'm not sure whether this dovetails with it or is in opposition to it.
No, it does. It works with it.
But the issue is how well you can apply that to a particular area. And it seems like it would be something good for the town center concept if you have also the regional cooperation of the planning board and the county board. And it seemed like in one of your examples in Saratoga, they were using the Transportation Council from the Capital District Transportation Council was a partner. And some of the other towns, it looked like they were almost autonomous. They had no regional influence at all. So I'm curious what the interaction is.
I think there's quite a range of that, depending on what various local governments are interested in the concept at a time. I think the example of Port Royal, South Carolina, actually was part of a countywide plan to implement FormBasedCode, and then each municipality then took the lead on their particular zone of control. So I think there's quite a range. I know, for example, the city of Cincinnati has implemented citywide FormBasedCode, and then what they're doing is that individual districts can elect to adopt it at a given time and go through it on that basis. So there's quite a range of options for implementation.
We didn't discuss St. Lucie tonight either, but that was also a county-based application of FormBasedCode. So that is certainly something we're looking into and we'll be compiling as part of the report as well.
I guess the issue really is, it's like design guidelines for the residential portion. But let's just say the whole thing was that your building couldn't be any bigger than 10 by 12. And you had a whole little patch of 10 by 12 buildings. And you could put a grocery in, and you could put an auto body shop, and you could put a laundromat and so in terms of the difference between zoning with restriction in terms of the type of thing that goes there as opposed to what it looks like. I think that's a concern at some level, that there are reasons, well, first of all, the town doesn't need 4 or 5 little groceries, scattered around, and it doesn't need several schools. And so it isn't going to build itself little hamlets like that. But I guess the concern exists about what is there to say that an auto body shop can go in a place that residents don't care to have. What restricts that if it's not a zoning by use?
Typically, there are use restrictions in FormBasedCode. It's just not the focus of it. It's not the organizing principle. It's
secondary.
Yeah, exactly. It's a secondary.
But it's there.
It's there. It's typically. It's just less. The list of restrictions is shorter, and it's not the focus of how zoning is organized.
And you could certainly say, like, we don't want any auto body stores. You could also say that the auto body store has to look somewhat like a house, has to sound somewhat like a house, it has to have windows on it. It can't be, bright and blue with a gigantic neon sign and an industrial roof. And so you could look at, like, how can that form kind of fit in with kind of a residential area and kind of work with that a little better.
I think we need a hotel, a really nice hotel in Lansing, and when the gambling goes in, it could just be a casino. I'm not saying that, but we do need a nice hotel. We have rooms, but that's only so many rooms. And this area could use a nice place where a family can come and visit and have a nice place to hang out. It could be a really, like a Raja spa kind of place. That would be awesome to have something like that. Huh?
There is a group who is going in that direction.
That would be awesome to have that.
They're over
And a wellness center.
But that's what they're doing.
Workout.
Seriously, it's like the yoga club is a kind of new thing over on Common Road. And that's kind of their long-term plan. It's interesting, to say the least, and, they can pull it off.
You got back, you mentioned the comprehensive plan before. I was on the website tonight, town website, and I could not find the old plan that was written back in 07 or 09 or whatever it was. I see meeting minutes, I see the drilling discussion, and I see this document, which is sort of the comprehensive plan update, but I can't find the plan.
I understand that totally.
At least it's not obvious, and so
No, it's not.
the website needs to be, we really need to devote a page to the comprehensive plan, what it's saying, because before we even talk about FormBasedCode, we really need to have a comprehensive plan for the town. That's number one, because that outlines your vision.
Yep.
And that needs to be brought on to by consensus by the town, not just issued, here's our comprehensive plan, we hired a consultant, and here it is. It needs to be a collaborative process with people in town. This document, I'd just like to point out, there's only 4,400 households in Lansing. There's only 11,000 people here. And there's a question on the back of this document that says, what would you do if you had $5 million? Well, that's $1,100 per household, and the median income here is only 25 grand. They're talking about making a minimum wage of $15 an hour, that's 30 grand a year. So let's be realistic. This town does not have a lot of money. We like these ideas. There's a lot of us here that probably make more than 25 grand a year, but there's a lot of people that aren't in this room that don't. So I think it's important that before we start launching programs that are going to cost us money, whether it's a sewer or whether it's a town center north of the village. I consider the village to be the town center, even though it's at the south end of the town of Lansing. I think we got to look at what resources we really truly have. There's only 4,400 households here, and most people make median incomes $25,600 a year. So, comprehensive plan, realism about the kind of resources we have, and then make sure you build consensus.
I think that would be a good time to separate it. And I would like to explain that question there is, perhaps it wasn't framed very well, but it's, that's kind of connected with the thinking about the development typologies and kind of what kind of places do people prefer, what kind of places do people think would make sense economically from a business feasibility perspective. So that's not if you had $5 million of town budget. This is if you were, it's just sort of a little game kind of thinking of what if you were a developer, what would you build?
If you could do what you wanted, what would you do and where would you do it?
Yep.
I'd like to ask a question. I mean, of all the places that you talked about, Saratoga Springs is the only one that I have actually visited.
Sure.
And I remember driving through the downtown area of Saratoga Springs. On one side of the street, there are huge commercial establishments. These are not big box stores, but they are nationally known stores. The Loft is one I remember. There are others like that. Clothing stores are predominantly on one side of the street. On the other side of the street are very old buildings. Some of them have been reimagined on the inside, and they have a whole bunch of little shops in one particular building, and I know that that was done in downtown Binghamton many, many years ago. And then you get out of that main drag of downtown Saratoga Springs, and then there are real neighborhoods. But it was a city to begin with. It was not a rural area. You get out of downtown Saratoga Springs, and I did that one afternoon. I actually drove out and found a shop that I was looking for that was in a little strip mall. So, I mean, what I'd like to know is what was on that one side of the street where there are now all these commercial clothing stores, what was there before?
Well, I don't know. That's a good question.
And what did they have to go through in order to actually redo that one side of the street to first of all, I'm sure that those stores were not there to begin with. They were only there after they implemented form-based planning. And then, you know, how did they change it?
I think it might be the case that that's what may have been the impetus to build form-based code if those stores were built, say, 10, 15 years ago. You know, so that development would sort of match the existing fabric, the existing buildings that are appealing to people. I'm not familiar.
Yeah, there too, there's another factor that comes into play with that historic core, and that's that prior to form-based code, it is, and still is, a historic district. So essentially in Saratoga, it was taking what they already had as designated guidelines for the historic district, which was already in place, they developed it when they made the district, and applying that to form-based code and spreading that elsewhere. But those buildings have been there, they have been deemed historic, and use-wise, they changed, but architecturally, they didn't go on the exterior. But internally, they can change.
Well, on one side of the street, I agree. They are historic-looking buildings. They still look the same. But these big clothing stores that they have on the other side of the street, opposite all those, looks like the inside of a mall. It's not, you know, it's like walking down the main drag of the shops at Ithaca. The same kind of stores and set up, you know, one right after the other, one next to the other, with, you know, big storefronts. I didn't notice any buildings that looked historic on that side of the street. On the other side of the street, yes. And certainly in some of the neighborhoods off that main street, there were interesting buildings, interesting houses that had been made into shops and things like that. But I would like to know what those things looked like before.
Yeah, great. So I think we're going to take a break now, and there are a couple, I know some people have participated, some I think have not, but we have a couple of boards up there, a chance to write down some notes, opinions about what you guys think about various things in Lansing, and as well the packet, the stapled together sheets that that has been referred to. There are a couple of questions in there, and for us as outsiders in the town and trying to learn and guide our research in the right direction, it's really important to try to understand what people think and at least of the people who are gathered here today about what's going on in Lansing, what are the preferences, what people feel is possible. So if you could answer those questions, that would be really useful. And if you have any questions about what it means, just ask any one of us.
You want to talk about the board?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So on the second sheet, there are small, hard to understand pictures that are in black and white. And then the third sheet has a couple, basically a question to rate those and then offer your comments on what you think of those kind of places. And those pictures match the pictures that are on that table over there. So you can look at the number, look at the table, and sort of offer your thoughts. And that would be really helpful so that we can have a little bit of understanding as we can continue and conclude this project in December.
And this will help you decide the volumes and scales of...
Exactly, yeah, what we can sort of recommend as sort of just the starting point if Lansing chooses to take up this idea and go further with it.
But I think what this is just a sample of how neighborhoods would help form the form-based code.
Exactly.
Using this kind of exercise, this is not the exercise is going to dictate anything.
Exactly, yeah. This is very much just a preliminary discussion, sort of just to have a starting point of what some people think, what seems to work, what seems to not work. If the real process is initiated, once we're finished with what we're doing. So,
The old days, when we had 15-minute meetings,
There